Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Commander Pod, your Magic the Gathering podcast for all things Commander. My name is Kelton Howell.
And I'm Spencer Simpson. And today we're going to be talking about Kindred decks. So for those of you who don't know, Kindred decks were previously called Typal or Tribal decks. And they're decks that are built around a specific creature type. So some of the more popular creature types are dragons or elves or zombies. So a Kindred deck would just be a deck that's built specifically around those.
And we see a lot of these in Commander. If you've been playing for any amount of time or building decks yourself, you have seen or you have built one of these decks because they're very common in Commander. They're very popular. I think it's definitely an easy way to get into deck building.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started playing Commander, I literally only built Kindred decks. I mean, at the time they were called Tribal, right? But Kindred decks, because I felt like that was like the only thing, right?
Sure.
And it's not. There are tons of different types of decks you can build, and I've since started moving away from Kindred decks, honestly, sometimes. And we're going to talk about why today a little bit.
Yeah, and I do want to know, I think one reason why they are quite popular, especially for players first stepping into Commander, is that Commander deck building is extremely difficult and scary if it's your first time because there's such a large card pool and you don't know how many of what kind of effect you should have in a deck. It can be very difficult. It can be just very intimidating. And so when you build a Kindred deck, then it narrows the scope. You're like, I'm going to build a zombie deck. And so it's like, okay, well, let me just like look at all the zombies and pick the zombies that I think are cool. And it really narrows the scope on what kind of cards you're going to include in your deck. Yeah,
for sure. And as a result, it can sometimes, I think that makes it easier to build the deck, for sure. And it can also sometimes make the deck building process not quite as fun.
Yeah.
You know, especially when building a Kindred deck, especially.
Yep.
And you might be saying, well, Spencer, Kelton, like all Kindred decks are really fun and I really love building them. And I think that's really true. Like that's what makes Kindred decks really fun is you find a creature type that you think is cool. But sometimes that can make them feel like stale or on rails because you have 36 lands and then you have 30 to 35 of this creature type. And then you have, 30 cards remaining. And now you're building a 30 card commander deck because you're filling it with this creature.
Yeah, and it feels like a solved problem in a lot of ways for those 30 creatures. Let's take a look at zombies as an example again. If you're building a zombie Kindred deck and there's nothing else to the deck, there's no other, sub-themes or synergies, you're just strictly, I just want to play as many zombies as I can, then really what you're going to do is you're going to look at the 30 to 35 most powerful zombie cards, and those are the ones that go in your deck, which it can end up making it feel very similar to every other zombie Kindred deck out there. And you might have even mirror matches if you play in a pod where someone else has built a zombie Kindred deck. And that is fun. Zombies are cool. Build your zombie decks. You don't have to stop building your zombie decks. But if it has become stale for you, or if it feels like it is an on rails experience, deck building for a specific creature type, then we have some ideas that might help it feel a little bit less on the rails.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's how it's felt for me sometimes. And so we've had to resort to some of these strategies. But we don't start from the beginning, right? So when you're building a Kindred deck, there's kind of two paths to that, right? Which is you find a creature type that you think is cool and you choose a commander to build around, or you find a really cool commander that supports some sort of Kindred strategy, and then you build a deck around that. Like one that just got printed that's really cool is Voya. Jaws of the Conclave, right?
That card's awesome.
It's a double Kindred deck, right? You're doing elves and wolves, which is sweet.
Which is such a cool flavor win. I do think the commander might be just a smidge too powerful. It's a really, really busted commander.
Yeah. Should we read it really quick?
Yeah, let's go ahead and read Voya. But Voya, for those unfamiliar with the lore, I believe is Tolsimir's companion. Like Tolsimir and Voya are an elf and a wolf who travel together and I don't know, adventure together. I don't know too much about the lore, but Tolsimir has had, I think, 2 or 3 cards now in Magic, and Voya has always been a token. And so Voya finally got its own card, and it's cool that it synergizes with both elves and wolves.
Yeah, really, really cool. Yeah, so for those who don't know, Voya, Jaws of the Conclave, just got printed in Murders at Karlov Manor as a promo card for just in pre-release packs, right?
Yep, that's the only place.
And
to
also
open
collector boosters, I guess, probably.
I actually don't know. I think it might only be pre-release packs.
Wow, that's really cool. Yeah, that explains its price. It's kind of pricey right now.
Yeah,
About like hovering around like $12, $13. But it is Voyage of the Conclave, 2 red, green, white for a legendary creature wolf with vigilance, trample, and ward 3 at 5/5. Right, 5.
Ward 3 is so powerful. That is so tough to deal with.
Ward 3 is absolutely bonkers. And then when it attacks, you put X +1/+1 counters on each creature you control, where X is the number of elves you control, and then you draw a card for each wolf you control. So like baseline, this is cast Voya, when draw a card whenever it attacks. It has vigilance and trample and ward 3, which is just crazy.
Yeah, and for those of you who have never played against or played with an elf or wolf deck, those are tokens that are extremely easy to make. So it just means that you are going to be getting tons of value off of Voya.
Yeah, I wish this was in Gruul so I could put it in my Faldorn deck.
Yeah, that would be really good.
That'd be sweet. So, anyways, Voya is an example of, a cool commander that you might see and be like, wow, that's a sweet wolf, and I want to turn that into an elf and wolf kindred deck. But sometimes as you look through these commanders, right, or creature types that you are interested in playing, the commanders that are heading those up can often not support other sub-themes or other deck building strategies, and so it does inherently put you to be more on rails.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you've built a lot of decks around zombies.
Yeah, I do like
that's
zombies.
A creature type that you have built a lot of, and you've built quite a few different commanders, I think. So how have you noticed between those commanders how well they lend to building around other sub-themes or just being top 35 zombie tribal deck?
Yeah, for sure. I built several. The first one I built was a Verena Lich Queen deck, which I thought was really, really cool. It's Esper, so white, blue, black, and it's 1 white, blue, black for 4/4. I guess I'll read it. For a legendary creature, zombie wizard, and whenever you attack with 1 or more zombies, you draw that many cards, then discard that many cards, and gain that much life. And then you can pay 2, exile 2 cards from your graveyard, and create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token, which is really cool because you get to loot a lot, and then it fills your graveyard, and then you can hold up mana for interaction and stuff, like we talked about last week or 2 weeks ago, and then use that mana to create more zombies to then be able to attack with more.
And I remember this deck, and playing against it, it felt very much like an Esper control combo deck, and a lot less like a zombie, your prototypical zombie kindred deck.
For sure. And my deck building strategies and like goals have changed since I built this one. So this may not be a great example, but it definitely felt less of an on-rails zombie deck where I'm just like shoving as many functional zombies as I can into the deck. And I will say, before I keep talking about the zombies one thing that has helped with building kindred decks is the number of creatures, like as they keep printing more and more creatures, like there are just a ton more options, which I think it does help a lot with things feeling like on rails, right?
And I do think that a lot of the sets that Wizards has released recently have had some strong kindred sub-themes to them. And a really good one was Lost Caverns of Ixalan. We went back to Ixalan, which was primarily pirates, vampires, merfolk, dinosaurs. And so we got a whole fresh round of those creature types in this new set. And those are some of the more popular creature types to build around. So that was awesome. We have been getting a lot of new kindred cards.
Yeah, whenever they print more of them, it feels like that archetype or that creature type, that kindred deck really gets a shot in the arm, which is really cool.
Yeah, you see it in prices too. You see that whenever a bunch of new vampire cards get printed, Edgar Markov goes up in value, and a bunch of the other big vampire cards.
Yeah, well, Edgar Markov is one I want to talk about a little bit later too, as maybe an example of one that's like more on rails, right? But I guess jumping back, like other zombie decks that I've built, Wilhelt the Rock Cleaver is my most recent one. Mm-hmm. Wilhelt was the face commander for the Midnight Hunt zombie precon deck, and is debatably like the best zombie commander for like pure zombie kindred, right? It's 2 black-blue for a 3/3 legendary creature zombie warrior. Whenever a zombie you control dies, if it didn't have Decayed, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token with Decayed, which is very cool. So it doubles up on all of your zombies, including tokens, as long as they don't have Decayed, which is pretty sweet.
Really
and
good.
then at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice a zombie. If you do, draw a card. So it's got some draw engine. It's got sacrifice triggers. It's just a really cool deck, and I've really enjoyed playing it, but it has felt more on rails than Verena did. And I think an example of a zombie commander that was really popular for a long time as a zombie Typal deck was the Scarab God, who was like the zombie commander for a while, right? And the Scarab God's very cool because I don't think like the optimal Scarab God deck is a zombie Kindred deck, right? Like
we've talked about this. Yeah, it has a lot of other sub themes that it actually likes more. Things like Mill and Reanimator and not necessarily zombie. And Scarab God, doesn't really care to have that many zombies in its own deck.
Yeah, for sure. But you can, which is cool. So you could build a really interesting Kindred deck with the Scarab God, and then put those other things in as sub themes, which I think is what can make the Kindred deck building process feel more interesting and less on rails for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that you mentioned while we were preparing for this episode is that a lot of the newer commanders have done a really good job of allowing Kindred strategies while also supporting these really cool and fun to play sub themes. The example that you gave was Edgar Markov, which is one of the original very, very popular and still is very, very popular vampire commanders. So he is 3 red, white, black for a 4/4 legendary creature vampire knight. And he has Eminence. So this came as part of the cycle of C17 commanders that had Eminence. So Eminence triggers whenever Edgar is on the battlefield or in the command zone. So you don't even have to cast Edgar to get this ability. It says whenever you cast another vampire spell, if Edgar Markov is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. And then Edgar himself has first strike, haste, and whenever he attacks, you put a 1/1 counter on each vampire you control. So obviously very powerful, very, very good in a vampire Kindred deck. But when compared to something like Strephon Mar Progenitor, that card cares about other things, not just necessarily casting vampires. Do you want to read that one for us?
Yeah, for sure. So Strephon is a deck that I have a deck for Strephon Mar Progenitor. Strephon is 2. Sorry, let me pull them up here. I was going to try to do it from memory, but we might as well.
Sure.
Read it here. So Strephon Mar Progenitor is 2 black-red, so Rakdos, so different color identity. So if you're trying to play a vampire deck with white, right, then like Edgar Markov is probably your obvious choice there. But 2 black-red for a legendary creature vampire noble at 3/2. It has flying. And at the beginning of your end step, create a blood token for each player who lost life this turn. So up to 4, right, including yourself. And then when Strephon attacks, you may sacrifice 2 blood tokens. If you do, you may put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. It gains indestructible until end of turn.
This is really cool. So Edgar just wants you to cast a bunch of small vampires. That's all it cares about. It's just very classic, creature type matters, flood the board with vampires type of deck. Strephon cares on the flip side. It's very interesting. Cares about big vampires. Doesn't care so much about the small vampires. He wants big vampires. But you can also build around blood tokens or other themes. And you have taken a really interesting take on this deck, which is an artifact deck. Your Strephon deck is like an artifact matters deck.
Yeah. I think primarily it's become more of an artifact matters deck with a vampire sub-theme. It's trying to take advantage of the blood tokens. Now, of course, every commander has cards that are like staples in that deck. So like an example for Strephon is Creeping Bloodsucker, which is a vampire, which is cool. And at the beginning of your upkeep, Creeping Bloodsucker deals 1 damage to each opponent, and you gain life equal to damage dealt this way. So keeps you in the game in Rakdos. You're paying a lot of life typically, and so you're wanting to keep up. And it drains your opponents, so it triggers Strephon, and you create 3 blood tokens in your end step.
So good.
So, which is really cool and fits the vampire theme, right? And Edgar Markov might want this one, right? And so you do end up playing some of the cards that are like staples in that Kindred format. But the way I build the deck is it really cares about blood tokens. Like I have cards like Duretti Scrap Savant, which is a planeswalker that lets you trade a artifact on the battlefield for one in your graveyard, right? And so I lose a blood token, who cares? And all of a sudden I've got Alhemret's Archive on the field, and I'm gaining twice as much life and drawing twice as many cards for my blood tokens, right? So there's lots of... it was a really... for a while, I thought it actually felt really stale, and I didn't like playing it until I kind of had to change my mindset a little bit and was like, you know what? No, I think I want to make this a artifact deck, and then we'll have somewhat of a vampire sub-theme, even though it's still a Kindred deck.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that you and I have both been leaning more heavily into lately as we build kind of newer, different kinds of Kindred decks that aren't so focused on just playing a bunch of one creature type, but instead either having a sub-theme or where the Kindred type is the sub-theme. So a few decks that I have built recently that do this are the first Sliver. So Slivers are a very popular Kindred creature type, and they interact very well together. But what I think is the most fun about the first Sliver and is really cool about it is the ability to cascade. And you want to make sure that you hit every cascade that you can because they cascade off of each other. And so for me, a major sub-theme of the deck is top deck manipulation. I have a ton of cards in the deck that let me manipulate my library so that I'm making sure that I hit cascade triggers. So a couple of those that I think are really cool are Scroll Rack. So this is an artifact for 2 mana. You can pay 1 and tap it, and then exile any number of cards from your hand face down. Then you put that many cards from the top of your library into your hand. Then you look at the exiled cards and put them on top of your library in any order. So you get a swap any number of cards from your hand with cards on top of your library and put them in any order. So you can stack your deck, which is really cool. And another one is Miri's Guile, which is 1 green mana for an enchantment. During your upkeep, you may look at the top 3 cards of your library and then put them back in any order. So just getting to do that over and over again is really cool. A couple of the other decks are Brago. I've been building a Brago deck that is an artifacts theme, and it has a Golems and Splicers sub-theme. So an example of one of the Splicers is Blade Splicer. It's 2 and a white for a 1/1 Phyrexian Human Artificer, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token, and golems you control have first strike. So it plays a bunch of these Splicer cards that make golems when they enter the battlefield, and then give the golems some kind of buff. And then when Brago flickers them in and out of the battlefield, then you get to create more golems, and that's the way that the deck kind of works. And it's really the way the deck wins is by creating a bunch of golems. So there's a bunch of cards that care about golems in that deck. And then
this is one that you landed on. You landed on this sub theme because you were having a hard time building it in a way that felt fair and fun. Right?
Yeah, it's really easy to build Brago in a way that takes a million game actions and just ends up either locking everybody else out of the game or just making it generically unfun to play against. And so I needed a way to win the game that wasn't just locking other players out. And that's when I realized, hey, there's actually a bunch of really cool artifacts and creatures that make artifact creature tokens when they enter the battlefield. A lot of them, like I said, Lost Caverns of Ixalan introduced a lot of really cool gnomes and golems into the format, which is really exciting. So golems was kind of where I ended up in terms of something that can actually affect the board and win the game and not just stall things out.
Yeah, well, what's interesting about this too is like Brago doesn't care about any of those.
No.
And so often when you're building like a Kindred deck, the commander does like supports that theme and also the whatever sub themes you're trying to do. But that's a really cool take on a Kindred deck is to say, hey, this is a Brago columns and splicers Kindred deck.
Yeah, it's fun.
With the Blink theme.
It's definitely interesting. The last one I did want to mention really quick was just Alila, Artful Provocateur. This one is a very popular fairy commander. It's 1 white, blue, black for a 2/3 fairy warlock with flying, death touch, lifelink. Other creatures you control to fly and get +1/+0. And then whenever you cast an artifact or an enchantment spell, you create a 1/1 blue fairy creature token with flying. Yeah, lots of people build this as a fairy deck. It is a fairy deck. It is a fairy tribal deck, but it's an enchantress deck. There's only like 3 or 4 fairies in the deck because I just care about playing enchantments, knowing that when I play an enchantment, I also get a fairy. Every enchantment in my deck is also a fairy. So that's also like a fun way. I've always wanted to build an enchantress deck, and this felt like a really fun way to do that while also getting some neat little payoff, and wasn't maybe a stereotypical enchantress deck.
Yeah, and also not a stereotypical like fairy deck, right?
Yeah.
Like and Alila herself is the one that allows you to do that, right? And so sometimes when you are trying to build a Kindred deck, maybe the best thing to do is to look at the commander you're playing. If you feel like it's boring, right? If you feel like it's on rails or feeling stale, or like you don't get enough of a creative process when building your deck, maybe you need to switch your commander into something that facilitates that a little bit more. So, all really good examples. So the next thing we wanted to talk about is actually building around the Kindred synergies, right? So a fun way to build a Kindred deck is to make sure you have lots of fun sub-themes, but you also need the Kindred cards that support the Kindred strategy. So we have a list here, and the first thing we want to start out is Anthem effects. Do you want to read some of those to us, Kelton?
Absolutely. So these are effects that pump your creatures of the chosen creature type. The first one on the list is Adaptive Automaton. It's 3 mana for a 2/2 construct. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. It is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and then other creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1. I corrected myself because that is very important wording.
Very important distinction, yeah.
Things happen differently if it enters. If you choose the creature type as it enters or when it enters, because of enter the battlefield abilities. If something cares about something, an elf entering the battlefield, Adaptive Automaton gets to enter as an elf and trigger those abilities, which is really great. The next one on the list is Vanquisher's Banner, 5 mana for an artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures you control of the chosen type get +1/+1, and whenever you cast a creature spell of the chosen type, you draw a card. And then the last one is Metallic Mimic, 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact creature shapeshifter. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Metallic Mimic is the chosen type in addition to its other types, and each other creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So it's very similar to Adaptive Automaton, but instead of giving it the static Anthem effect, it's actually going to give them a permanent +1/+1 counter, which is really cool.
Yeah, which can be a lot better, especially because it's cheaper. It costs 2 mana instead of 3, and can come down before you're casting a lot of those creatures. So, and just to clarify, the distinction between as it enters and when it enters, I think I really should look into this. But the when it enters to me means that it's going to go on the stack, right?
Yeah.
Ability goes on the stack, so it doesn't actually enter as that creature type, right? So, which is important. The next one we want to talk about here is card advantage. There are lots of different cards that give you card advantage in Kindred decks. We're going to talk about 3 of them. And we're also going to talk about some other ones, I think, later in a different section as well. But one of the most popular ones would be Distant Melody in blue. Distant Melody is 3 and a blue for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. Draw a card for each permanent you control of that type.
This card can get out of hand. There are quite a few times when this is in your hand and it feels like such a bad card. You have like 2 creatures of a creature type and you're like, wow, this is 4 mana, draw 2 cards, and that just feels so bad. But I have had games where I have 18 creatures, usually tokens, on the battlefield that share a creature type, and wow, does this get very, very good very quickly.
Yeah, and I think it really depends on like the creature type that you are playing. Like I've tried to play this in zombie decks, and typically you're making fewer zombies than you're going to be making like fairies, for example, or like humans. Like those tokens, I feel like just fly off the shelves, and zombie tokens you have to do a little bit more work to get, and so probably belongs in more decks like that, right?
Absolutely.
The next one here is Realm Walker, which is 2 and a green for a 2/3 creature shapeshifter, which is sweet because it has the changeling ability, which means it counts as every creature type, including the creature type that you are trying to build around. And it says, as Realm Walker enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You may look now. That's interesting because it already enters as that creature type. So
yeah, it doesn't matter. That's just the way all of the choose a creature type abilities are templated. They I think almost every one of them happens as it enters the battlefield and not when it enters the battlefield.
Gotcha. So it's not even okay. Very cool.
Yeah.
You may look at the top card of your library at any time. you may cast creature spells from the chosen type from the top of your library. Really cool. I don't think people think about stuff like this as card advantage as much as they should. I mean, if you hit a land, this isn't doing very much, but you know a land is coming.
Yeah, I was going to say that middle line is actually probably quite often overlooked because people want to be hitting the creature spells off the top of their library, but just knowing the top card of your library at any time is very good. This is a great card.
Yeah, it extends your hand by 1, right, virtually.
Yep.
And then it extends your hand indefinitely as long as you have the mana to cast whatever is on top, and it's that creature type.
Yeah,
right?
you do have to have a lot of creatures of that type for you to get that effect, but it can be done. And in a lot of Kindred decks, you're just going to have 30, 35, 40 creatures of a given type.
Yeah, for sure. And the last one here is Pact of the Serpent, which is 1 black for a sorcery, and you choose a creature type. Target player draws X cards and loses X life, where X is the number of creatures they control of the chosen type, which is interesting because this is something that can be hit by bolt bend effects, right?
That's actually so true. Yep.
It may not matter. True. Probably doesn't matter in most situations. It's basically Distant Melody in black, except you also lose life.
Yeah, I did think of something really interesting, though, that I've never thought of with this card. Because you can target any player, you can target an opponent. So if an opponent is playing a Kindred deck and they have, I don't know, Spencer, you play Faldorn, and you can create a lot of wolves. If you have like more wolves than you have life, I can target you with Pact of the Serpent. You draw a bunch of cards, but then when it comes time to lose life, you're dead.
Yes, I think that is a somewhat niche use case.
Yeah, don't put this card in your deck thinking that that's how it's going to play. But I have never thought about this card this way before. And like I said, I have been in games where someone has 15, 20, 50 cards, creatures of a given type because they're creating tokens. They're doing something really broken in a Kindred strategy. And it's just not unrealistic for you to be able to play this card that way.
No, totally. In fact, I played a game like 2 days ago where that would have mattered, and I probably could have won the game if I'd had a Pact of the Serpent, which would have been pretty sweet. So, yeah, the next one we want to talk about is Ramp and Mana Fixing.
Yeah, there's a lot of great cards that go into this. We're just going to highlight a few of them here. One of them, and boy, do I love that this is the first one on the list. Herald's Horn. This is 3 mana for an artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creature spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. This is an effect that gives you... It discounts the amount of mana you pay instead of having to tap it for mana. So theoretically, if you were to cast 2 spells that share that creature type in a same turn, this card has now provided you 2 mana worth of advantage instead of just tapping for 1 mana. That's very good. Generally, this effect is very, very good. And the idea that it's also giving you creature type or cards off the top of your library if they share a creature type is super, super powerful. I have stopped playing this card because it doesn't play that way as often as I would like it to, especially for 3 mana. And I feel like this card is just going to look really bad in comparison to the next card on the list, which is Urza's Incubator. And that's the same cost, 3 mana. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. Creature spells of the chosen type cost 2 less to cast. I think that the advantage that you're getting from a card like Urza's Incubator is just so much better. Granted, Urza's Incubator is like 12 times the cost of Herald's Horn. But it's I think just that much better of a card. And Herald's Horn, in a lot of cases, I would just rather have a 2 mana rock, I think. Yeah, but I think you're a little higher on this card than I am.
No, so you're having me coming around on this because I do think you're right. For it to be more than a mana rock, you have to be consistently casting 2 cards of that creature type a turn, right? Yeah. And then it becomes like
a slightly better mana rock.
Yeah, not Sisay's Ring, like Worn Power Stone, right?
Yeah, it's a Worn Power Stone.
It's a Worn Power Stone that also like draws you cards.
Occasionally draws you cards. You have to have a lot of those creature type cards in your deck in order for you to be drawing cards reliably off of Herald's Horn.
Yeah, and casting 2 per turn, right?
And casting 2 per
Yeah,
turn.
the density has to be pretty high for this to be. And I have this in one of my decks. I have this in my Wilhelm, the Rot Cleaver deck. Potentially, I should be running just like a colorless Mana Rock. I will say, especially in Dimir, black blue, often you're kind of hurting for good sources of like ramp, specifically colored ramp, which this does not do. So I'm not helping my case here.
Yeah.
So maybe I need to take this out. I'll have to see how this one does.
I just think what is exceptionally deceptive about these kinds of cards is it is not ramping you for 1 mana. It is discounting creature spells of a specific creature type by 1 mana. And so like a Worn Power Stone, for example, you can spend that mana on any spell. If you don't have an elf in your hand, you can spend it to cast a sorcery, and that's great. Herald's Horn, if you do not have an elf to cast that it meaningfully discounts, you're out of luck. Herald's Horn now does absolutely nothing except for occasionally draw you a card. So it's just 2 effects that I think play inconsistently enough that even together, it generally doesn't have a place in my deck. But it is pretty good in Kindred decks, especially if you have a very, very high density. I do play this card in some of my decks that have like the 35 to 40 cards that share a creature type in the deck. It makes more sense in those decks, but do watch which decks you're putting this in.
Yeah, for sure. Not to beat a dead horse, but I think I typically compare this to like the emerald, not the emeralds, the medallions. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Emerald medallions.
And it's not the medallions.
And it's not as good as the medallions. It's not
not.
a medallion. Yeah, it's easy to make that comparison though when you see the discount.
Yeah, it is.
So as far as mana fixing, we've got several things here. We've a lot of lands, and you pointed out that some of these are just. So Cavern of Souls. We'll start with Cavern of Souls. Cavern of Souls is like the poster child for Kindred decks mana fixing, right? Cavern of Souls is a land. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. You can add a colorless, or you can add 1 mana of any color and spend it only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type, and that spell can't be countered.
Yeah, that last line is very important. That makes this card really, really good.
Yeah, it absolutely does. However, I would say creature counters are fewer and further between typically. Like counterspell and select few others can counter creature spells, but you're often not as worried about that. And so I think the next two, Secluded Courtyard and Unclaimed Territory, can fill that slot pretty easily for 1/100th of the budget, right?
Yeah. Yeah, Secluded Courtyard is a great card. It's a land. It enters the battle. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Taps to add a colorless mana. Taps to add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type, or activate an ability of a creature source of the chosen type. So very similar to Cavern Souls. You do get the ability to use the colored mana on the abilities of creatures of the chosen type. Does not give it uncounterable. Once again, comes up especially a lot less in lower power decks, lower power games, but something to keep in mind. And then one that is just a little bit worse than Secluded Courtyard, but also very good, is Unclaimed Territory. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type, tap to add a color, tap to add 1 mana of any color, spend it only to cast a creature spell of the chosen type. So even more narrow than the other two, but does generally about the same thing.
Yeah,
and costs 18 cents.
And then the last one here that comes in just about every pre-constructed deck that cares about Kindred strategies is Path of Ancestry. This one does enter tapped, which makes it, I think, worse in the sense that it enters tapped, but I do think the effect is potentially better than the other ones. Add one mana of any color in your commander's color identity. So, and can be spent on anything, which is awesome. So I think it's, in that sense, it's very good. And then when that mana is spent to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with your commander, scry 1. And I think it's important to note that includes your commander.
It does. A lot of people miss that trigger when they play their commander using mana from Path of Ancestry.
Yeah, which is pretty cool. It lets you look at the top card of your library, fix it. If you're playing Herald's Horn, maybe you put in Path of Ancestry instead.
Yeah, this is a great card. It does enter tapped, so beware of that. That can be punishing, especially in higher power level games. You're probably not running too many Kindred strategies in super high powered games, especially like in CEDH. That doesn't really make sense. But yeah, early in the game, if this enters the battlefield tapped, doesn't really make that much of a difference, and it's very, very powerful.
For sure.
Another category that we have in cards that help with building around kindred strategies is interaction. There's just a couple we want to hit here, though. There are quite a few of these effects that are specific to certain creature types, so make sure you look those up on Scryfall or wherever you search your Magic cards. But these ones are generic for any creature type. The first one is a relatively new card that came with the Lord of the Rings Commander decks, and it is a doozy. This is Raise the Palisade. It is 4 and a blue for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. Return all creatures that aren't of the chosen type to their owner's hands.
I slept on this one. I should have bought it when it was $2.
This is exceptionally good. And it is, to be honest, does not belong just in Kindred decks. I play this in a lot of my Commander decks, and I will just choose the creature type of my Commander, the one that's the most obscure and will be the least likely for opponents to also have, and just return everybody's stuff except for my Commander generally to their owner's hands, and that's quite good.
Yeah, it's really, really good. I mean, when I first read this, to be honest, I read it as like Aether Spouts, which is 3 blue instant. For each attacking creature, its owner puts it on top or bottom of their library, which, albeit only affects one player, but it's not a particularly good card.
No, I think that's what you would expect this card to play like, and that is absolutely not what it plays like. It plays almost like Psych Rift.
Yes.
Especially in Kindred decks. It plays
exactly.
exactly like Psych Rift.
Exactly like Psych Rift for only
for
creatures.
Yeah.
Psych Rift does have the added benefit of hitting everyone's enchantments and artifacts and ramp and whatever. Yeah. But yeah, very, very good. Probably the best one in this category.
Yep.
And the next one is Crippling Fear. 2 black for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. Creatures that aren't of the chosen type get -3/-3 till end of turn. -3/-3 doesn't seem like a lot. That can be pretty huge. That's a lot of stuff.
It gets a lot of stuff, especially in Commander, where not all your creatures are huge. A lot of them are like utility pieces or value pieces, and they're just not that beefy. So -3/-3 actually clears off a lot of the board. Clears off a lot of tokens. A lot of tokens are 1/1s or 2/2s. Clears off all the mana dorks, things like the elves and the birds. And it really actually has a generally pretty high impact if you're playing a Kindred focused strategy.
Yeah, and crucially gives -/, and is only at 4 mana, right?
Yeah,
that can open up a lot of attacks. Like I would think in a Kindred deck, it's better than things like Languish, which is the same mana cost and gives all creatures -4/-4.
Definitely, yeah.
And because it will let your creatures not shrink and also attack into now these shrunken creatures that haven't died, right? So I think...
and Languish is a card that gets played. I mean, that is a card that gets played in Commander, and Crippling Fear does a better effect if you are in a Kindred strategy.
Yeah, for sure. So the next ones we want to talk about here, you might be thinking, well, Spencer Kelton, you missed some of the most powerful draw and board wipe effects for Kindred decks, and that's because we've saved them for their own category here. It is the Commander 2017 Kindred Cycle.
And actually, now that you've said Commander 17, it just triggered for me that this is the same set that we got Edgar Markov and the other Eminence commanders from, and that just makes that set feel even just that much better. It was a very good set.
Yeah, that set is... I remember looking up so I got into Commander a little bit later than that. I think those were still around, and I could have bought them for $40, embarrassingly, when I first started, but I was just kind of figuring out what I was getting into in Magic.
Yeah.
And since then, looked into what is in the Edgar Markov precon.
Yeah.
And it's got Edgar Markov, and I think it has Kindred Dominance, which is one we're going to be talking about here. And I also think it has Teferi's Protection. Like, it has just so much heat in that deck.
It does have Teferi's Protection. I actually think it has Kindred Boon. I'll have to go back and check, but Kindred Boon is the first one that is on this list here, and it is as Kindred Boon enters, it's 2 white for an enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type, 1 and a white as an activated ability, put a divinity counter on target creature you control of the chosen type, and each creature you control with a divinity counter on it has indestructible. It takes a lot of mana to get this going, but once you do, it's pretty powerful. I mean, it costs 6 mana to give the first thing indestructible, but after that, it's just 2 mana.
Yeah, I mean, so you drop this on turn 4. It's 2 mana at instant speed too, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So you can hold up mana, and it's basically interaction on an enchantment,
Yeah, okay,
right?
that is pretty good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's pretty sweet.
Yeah, that being able to activate that at instant speed is definitely much better.
Yeah, I think that's pretty quality. That's one I've never considered and probably will, actually, now that I've seen it. The next one here is also one that is probably, I think these two are probably the least popular of these Kindred cycles, is Kindred Charge, which is 4 red for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. For each creature you control of the chosen type, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. Pretty straightforward. Classic red. Creating hasty tokens that exile. I think there's ways to do cool shenanigans around this, but probably not the most powerful one on this list.
Yeah, it's just very expensive. The best one off this list, I'm just going to make that claim. I don't think there's any real dispute here. Kindred Discovery. You have likely already heard of this card. 3 blue for an enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a creature type. Whenever a creature type or a creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, you draw a card.
This card's so busted.
It's so good.
It's incredible.
Really good. And,
This is
and
one-
once again, this is one that makes its way into decks that aren't just Kindred decks. Like if you have a commander that has a creature type and shares with a few other creatures and you're going to be doing a lot of attacking, it's actually still pretty good in your deck.
Yeah,
it doesn't
the
have
fact
to be
that
super
it's
heavy.
enter the battlefield or attacks is just wild.
Yep.
And it triggers off of like, you would expect a card like this, especially nowadays, to say something like non-token before creature, right?
Yeah.
Like,
or the first time each turn, or some like once per turn.
Totally,
Yeah.
totally. The fact that like in my Will Help the Rock Cleaver deck, every time I create a Decayed Zombie, I draw a card is absolutely absurd.
Yeah.
Like it's really it's a cool card. It's my favorite one of the list as well. One that has been kind of outside of the realm of affordability for some people's decks is Kindred Dominance, which just got a reprint, which is awesome and really tanked the price. It is 5 black for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. Destroy all creatures that aren't of the chosen type. So very, very good. Honestly, I think this has been outclassed by Raise the Palisade, especially if you're playing blue.
I think that Raise the Palisade is just better. 7 mana is a lot to dump into an effect like this. And it just doesn't always resolve the way you want it to.
Totally.
But it's still very good.
Still very, very good.
I mean,
But
this is very oftentimes it has a similar effect to something like In Garrick's Wake, which is a powerful card, but has the same issue. It's very expensive and frequently doesn't resolve the way you want it to.
Yeah, I mean, In Garrick's Wake is so this is cheaper than that. And so if you're building around and really one more expensive than a lot of like board wipes. A lot of them are like 6 mana, right? So quite good. Raise the Palisade, if you're playing blue, I would put that in there before this any day because you dodge creature death effects as well, right? Death triggers.
Yeah,
Which
yeah,
is
you do.
really sweet. And sometimes I want stuff in my yard because my next card's going to bring it back out or whatever.
Totally.
Not all decks have that, but and then the last
all
one
of
here,
yours do though.
but all of mine do. Yep, that is true. The last one here is Kindred Summons. We talked about this one before as being potentially amazing and also not.
Yeah, so it has the same issue. It's 5 green, so it's also 7 mana. It's an instant. Choose a creature type. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal X creature cards of the chosen type, where X is the number of creatures you control of that type. Put those cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest of the revealed cards into your library. Yeah, I mean, this sounds great. I have 10 elves out on the battlefield. I cast Kindred Summons, which would be very easy to do with 10 elves because they usually give you mana. And then you get 10 more elves. What's not to love about that?
Yeah, I mean, this has to be specifically for elf decks, right? Elves are featured in the art.
It's got elves on the card, yeah.
Yeah, I just don't see a situation where you're going to be able to. First of all, it's an instant, which is cool.
Yeah.
But how often are you holding up 7 mana to then? Oh, instant speed Kindred Summons. I have like Galadrim Ambush in elf deck specifically is one that I think is significantly better than this. It's a fog that creates elves for each damage you would have taken, right?
Yeah.
Which is, very,
Pretty
very good. So
yeah, once again, Yeah, I think it's very similar to Kindred Dominance. It is super good. It is not always going to resolve the way you want it to, just because people aren't going to allow a big 7 mana potentially end the game type spell all the time. But the times that you do cast this card and it resolves and you get the X creature cards, it's going to be really good. Yep.
Yeah. Yep. I think the takeaway from this section is play Kindred Discovery, play blue. Blue's the best color.
And then and then play the rest where they really fit well with the theme of your deck. And they're obviously much better at lower power levels as well.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Okay, our last section might be one of the most powerful sections of all, and the section is Roaming Throne, which contains the card Roaming Throne.
Yes. Yep. Roaming Throne, printed in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, is a 4-mana artifact creature golem. It's a 4/4 with Ward 2, which is crazy, and you'll see why. As Roaming Throne enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Roaming Throne is the chosen type in addition to its other types. If a triggered ability of another creature you control of the chosen type triggers, it triggers an additional time.
I think so. This card, obviously, people thought was very good, and then they realized it was really, really good, and that's why it's so expensive now. But I think what happened was nobody realized how many of the Kindred relevant abilities are triggered abilities, and people just would play Roaming Throne, and then all of a sudden just absolutely get so much advantage from doubling triggered abilities and be like, oh, this is really good. This actually does way more in my deck than I thought it would. So it's just something that fits very well into the strategies of Kindred type decks. Number one, it is a creature of the creature type that you are trying to build around, because it has that it enters as the chosen type. But just a lot of the stuff in your deck that cares about your creature type is generally a triggered ability. Like, I mean, Kindred Discovery just gets out of hand. You draw a card when Roaming Throne comes in, and then whenever you attack, yeah, no,
Kindred Discovery, it has to be a creature.
Kindred Discovery doesn't
type.
work.
No.
Ooh, okay. Well, I was worried. I haven't seen this on the battlefield at the same time as Kindred Discovery yet, and I was very worried about how that was going to go.
No,
but I have seen this against Zada.
Yeah, in a Zada deck, which notably, Zada Hedron Grinder is here. We might as well read Zada while we're here. Zada Hedron Grinder is 3 and a red for a legendary creature Goblin ally at 3/3. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery that spell that only targets Zada, copy that spell for each other creature you control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. So it basically takes your 1 mana red cantrip spells and copies them. So if you have 8 creatures and you're casting Accelerate, which gives a creature haste, and you draw a card, all of a sudden you're drawing a card for each creature you control. It's crazy. Yeah. Very good deck. Notably, not often a Goblin Kindred deck. Mm-hmm. And so we've been able to see how, and this is partially what has affected the price of Roaming Throne, it's just generically bonkers. Like any deck that has any sort of triggered abilities in it, and
where the commander has a triggered ability.
With a creature type. Yeah, exactly. It's quite good. So one to consider for your decks. You don't have to buy it.
Proxy it.
Yeah. It's really good.
Yeah, it's a really great card. Well, that's going to be everything from us for this week. We really hope that whether you're building Kindred decks or just trying to find some really fun Kindred sub-themes for your other decks, that some of the things that we shared today might be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. So please remember to check us out on YouTube, Spotify. Maybe for not much longer. We might be pivoting shortly to only being on YouTube. So please continue to check us out there. Like, subscribe, interact. All of these things help us. We've been so grateful for everyone who's been watching our show so far. We can't believe how many we've had checking it out already, and we hope you keep coming back. Check us out on thecommanderpod.com. You can get in touch with us there. Our email address is there. But until next time, remember to always pay the one.